In this lecture, we will be addressing the idea of racial socialization and how it is an institutional social force. Author Shirley Better provides us with a strong understanding of structural barriers that account for the persistence of what we recognize to be racist tendencies within a society or racism itself. She breaks these down into individual and institutional kinds of practices and, of course, structures as well. To give you an idea of this, we see that generally individuals will express racist tendencies based upon beliefs, attitudes, practices, and, of course, the structures that they are a part of as well, in this case, social structures. If we look at individual beliefs, for example, they may have a negative stereotype having to do with or associated with the appearance of an individual, such as their skin color. On an institutionalized level, or institutional level rather, beliefs, attitudes, practices, and of course structures can also allow racist issues within a society to persist. Looking at beliefs again through Shirley Better's lens, on an institutional level, we see the presumption, for example, of white supremacy as an institutionalized force and as a belief system that's being shared from one generation to the next, or the acceptance, individual and group, and of course institutional acceptance of social and economic inequality. It's a fact of life, right? That kind of attitude, that is an institutional belief, and that allows, in this case, racism and the inequalities that kind of grow from society wide racist behaviors and attitudes, it allows that to persist. So, when you have the chance, make sure to take a look at Shirley Better's work and look at how she, in a sense, breaks things down into individual and institutional practices and then groups them into beliefs, attitudes, practices, and of course, structures. In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at another author, in this case, Peggy McIntosh. She is a sociologist who really became an important contributor to the sociology landscape starting in the 1980s, and probably one of her most important ideas as it relates to institutional racism was the idea of an invisible knapsack. And so we'll take a closer look at that in order to understand some of these practices that allow racist tendencies to persist in a society. McIntosh is a senior researcher, or was a senior researcher rather, at Wesleyan College in Massachusetts, where she was the associate director for the Center for Women and Women's Studies. She has written extensively on white privilege, which is something that you are reading about, and she has also written extensively on inequality in terms of access to education. Peggy is co-director of the SEED project. SEED is an acronym for Seeking Educational Equality and Diversity, and she has made amazing strides as part of this project and as director of this project as well. We will be taking a closer look, as I said, at a metaphor that she provides us with, this idea of an invisible knapsack. An invisible knapsack is something that we as individuals carry along with us. It's something that, in a sense, is forged on an individual level, but there are, as Shirley Better has pointed out, there are institutional forces at work which continue to allow these particular ideas to persist, whether they're ideas of what others think of us or ideas having to do with what we think of others, and they're all contained in this invisible knapsack. The invisible knapsack concept focuses on the role of ethnicity in an individual's life. Peggy questions why there are varying levels of ethnic awareness between varying ethnicities that make up Western society. Her work, as I said before, has focused on the concept of individual awareness as it relates and interacts with the concept of privilege, but then she has expanded this to institutions or social institutions as well. From this notion of ethnic unawareness, she addresses the idea of what each of us takes for granted. So, awareness is something she eventually gets to, but then she also addresses the idea of unawareness, right? Things that are invisible to you that you take for granted. This concept of what you take for granted, she metaphorically recognizes as your invisible knapsack. And her work is testimonial in nature. She is white, she is Irish American in terms of her recognized ethnicity, and she has described her own invisible knapsack in her work. All right. Listed out here for you are a series of questions and statements that are designed to aid the individual working their way through them to understand better the idea of privilege. You may benefit from privilege, whether it's based upon your gender, or whether it's based upon your ethnicity, or your race, or how people perceive you. This idea of a knapsack and these statements initially appeared in a paper that Peggy put together in 1988 entitled White Privilege and Male Privilege. It was, again, a groundbreaking work. And in this case, she is highlighting 12 considerations for us to look at as we are trying to understand the concept of privilege. Take a moment, pause the lecture here, and read through these 12 points and reflect on them. Reflect on them on an individual level. And then I'd like to challenge you to expand that reflection to an institutional level or something that is structured within the society. Maybe it is schooling, maybe it is politics, maybe it is religion, maybe it is community in terms of local municipalities, maybe it is law enforcement and criminal justice, the court system. But in a sense, read through these and first of all, become self aware of privilege you may have or may not have, and then think about what contributes to that privilege. Powerful, isn't it? There are aspects of this list that are a little bit dated, but needless to say, for the most part, they do make us aware of privilege as it relates to things like leadership or the politics of our society. They make us aware of how people experience shopping, going to Walmart, and some of the assumptions that maybe a store clerk or a store security individual might have about them. It tells us something about the impact that biology can make when people racially profile others just by looking at them. You may experience that. And the process of socialization, the idea that when we are sitting around our kitchen tables, as our parents are introducing ideas to us, or as we as parents may be introducing ideas to others, in this case our children, what's the content of those messages? Is racism and inequality and the idea of white privilege or male privilege, is this something that we actively address around the kitchen table as we are bringing up our young? And if not, why? Is it something that you may believe is unnecessary given your individual experiences? So it's very reflective, and I think it is something that is a good activity, and it really it's something to return to periodically to maintain a good sense of self-awareness as it relates to your place in society. In Shirley Better's primer on social change and institutional racism, she also challenges us really on every page of the text to think deeply about our own society and how our society is changing, and then, of course, how we experience that change. And so, what I've done here in this slide is to itemize a few of the important initial considerations that Shirley introduces us to as we read through her text. What is the demographic breakdown of the United States? You may be experiencing a census period. When census is taken, that is identified by historians, by sociologists, as an important time when, on a demographic level, people can be heard or groups can be understood and identified. Unfortunately, sometimes that process is seen as intrusive to communities. And communities will sometimes look at the taking of a census and kind of the byproduct of that as being somewhat negative. They look at it with suspicion. Um, One of the things that I'd like to challenge you to do is to visit a government website, any of the us.gov websites that describe the demographics of American society and see if you can identify how the demography of our society has changed over time. What are some of the groups, ethnic or otherwise, that appear to be growing in our society? What is the ratio of gender in our society? And I think when you start to do that, you'll start to see forces at work, or at least kind of the raw material upon which structural forces can begin to make an impact. We live in a pluralistic society, meaning we live in a very diverse, racially and ethnically diverse society. Of course, that can be expanded to other aspects of life within behavior. Things like faith would fit into a more expanded expression of that. Does the United States, question to you, does the United States, in a sense, reflect that plurality? So when you turn on the TV, when you drive down the road, when you visit the grocery store, when you open the newspaper or begin to search the internet with regard to something that connects you to your society, what do you see? What are the images that you see? What are the faces that you see? Well, even the institution that you attend, let's say you go to college or university, does that university express the same kind of plurality that exists in American society? Because one of the things that we can be proud of, there's many things we can be proud of as Americans, but one of the things that I personally am proud of is how diverse our society is. It really is a patchwork or a quilt of many different traditions and many different ethnic groups, many different ideas, and that's our strength. Do our institutions reflect that? And then finally, take a look at what Shirley Better has to say regarding the browning of America. This is something that even today is an important topic. The idea that if you were to look at all Americans and blend their skin colors together, we're starting to see more diversity in skin color to the point where we are starting to see less whiteness in our own society. And that is something that we can definitely celebrate as well. But how is that portrayed? Think about how maybe the messages that you have heard regarding this subject, how were those messages presented to you? Were they presented positively, or were they presented in a negative light, or were they neutral? Because that is another thing that tells us regarding attitude, individual, group, and institutional. And if the attitude is negative regarding this wonderful trend of diversification in our society, then this is something that we really have to address because, again, we should celebrate that American dream as opposed to fear it. Another important topic, and I would say, from my own perspective, probably the most important topic as it relates to inequality and how people experience that, again, tying all the way back to Peggy's work, is this idea of our economy. The tax code is a very good example. Does the tax code, in a sense, reflect and account for the diverse nature of our society? Or are there groups within our society, or are there economic classes within our society that seem to be better represented in the tax code than others? How does a family experiencing poverty live in the United States differently than a family that may be living check to check, or a family that may have savings, but those savings are at risk, or a family that may be experiencing significant capital gain and significant savings? And how do all of those different families experience the notion of retirement or planning for the future? These are important kinds of considerations that we should make as we're looking at our economy, especially. Now, Better in her work is going to look at how the economics of our society could be restructured, and she begins to address this immediately in her text. She discusses the idea of peace when we are experiencing a kind of economic stability in our lives. Think about how you experience Christmas, right? One of the things that all of us want to do is give gifts at Christmas. But if that gift exchange results in a downturn in the economic stability of our household, or if we feel guilt when we are purchasing a gift for someone else, this can be really the opposite of peace. And this can be something that not everybody is experiencing, but is making a pretty significant impact on those who really are unable to do the things economically that they would like to do for their family or their household. Think about for a moment how we might change that. And again, I'm not using Christmas and gift exchange as the only example. I'm talking more broadly about the idea of feeling economically stable. Do you feel that you will be able to retire someday? And what will that retirement look like? Do you think you will have economic peace as you experience the latter years of your life cycle? Are there people in your life that maybe are retired but are having to take on a job, a side job, to be able to pay for health care, or to be able to vacation, or to be able to even make payments on their home? These are all important considerations because very often we will conflate the idea of social and economic class with every other aspect of our society. Your family may self-identify economically first, right? Well, we are a middle class working family, as opposed to maybe self-identifying or identifying a household according to a faith tradition or a history or a heritage. What Shirley Better's going to also do in much of her work is she's going to challenge us to look at things historically. And probably one of the most impactful periods economically within American society was the end of the Second World War. This was a boom not only in terms of population growth, but it was a boom in terms of the earning potential of families, the growth of our urban environments, and ultimately our employment landscape. The jobs were there. We were manufacturing. We were known to be a global manufacturer. And that very much was also a time, again, extending from the mid 1940s to really the mid 1960s. Uh, this was a time when not only was there a major growth in American society, and definitely an intensive pluralization of that society, but then there was also a establishment of strong values and strong structural ideas and practices as they relate to race and ethnicity. And we have to ask ourselves why. And are qualities of that still seen today? So the divide, for example, between the suburb and the city really can be tied back to the economic growth that we see following the Second World War. Racial tensions can be assigned to this. The challenge of desiring and establishing equality in our society and the failings of a good portion of those social movements were also things that can be tied to this period. Reflect on that for a moment. Douglas Glasgow is a scholar from Howard University. His work in the late 1960s and early 1970s was groundbreaking with regard to the idea of race, ethnicity, and how these two concepts connect to the structure of society. In 1971, he wrote extensively on public relief programs in the United States as the topic of welfare and the public systems that surrounded that outdoor relief effort were coming into question. Now, from a social historical point of view, his work addresses modern American philosophy, and it addresses the idea of liberal individualism, the idea of able bodiedness and being able to kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We think about, as again, an expression that may or may not be familiar to you, but we think about that as something now associated with a more conservative social and economic view of American society. The idea that there is this wide range of resources that are available to all individuals equally, which of course we know not to be the case, but that those individuals are then challenged to take advantage of those opportunities. And he was really addressing this as early as 1971 and asking, is this really something that either works, and is it really something that is is available to all people equally? And he was finding that was not to be the case. He was also then, of course, framing that in terms of the advent of social welfare and economic welfare. According to Glasgow, little has been actively done to change the economic system within the United States. The payment approach or payment oriented approach toward public relief has remained in place, at least at the time that he is writing his work. And we've really only seen expansions of ideas since the Social Security Act of 1935. We really have not seen any good reform in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Reform did come in the 1990s, but many today would say that that reform was somewhat forced and that the system of public relief, such as food stamps and other kinds of assistance programs, are still not meeting the need. A question that he poses is this idea of a reliance on large scale municipal bureaucracies. He asks, has our need for uh, government and government intervention when it comes to developing and pushing for equality, has this ended or is it increasing in nature? And has it increased in a sense since the 1930s when it was really initially coined, or at least when it became society wide? In his work, Glasgow then highlights a work intensive program, the WIN, that was spearheaded by the AFDC, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Now, this program was closed in the 1990s, but he was looking at the impact that this incentive program was making for a variety of low income environments and families that are associated with that. 21 mothers and their families qualified for the program at the time that he was studying it. and it was entitled A Neighborhood Family Day Care Parent Training Program, at least what he was looking at a little more specifically. Resulted in 22 individuals who would be eligible to take the civil service exam for daycare work. So, this idea of training people to be able to work. Six completed the exam and were hired in 1969 when he was studying this. This was a career line attempt at lessening the welfare roles. And to an extent, this still occurs even today. The idea of welfare to work is alive and well, and the idea of training programs for people who may not have the skills that allow them to uh, enter into the job market and competitively move through the job market landscape. He was looking at the effectiveness of this. And you will find that generally the programs are underfunded. Generally, they are successful by design, but unfortunately, due to political concerns, many of these programs are increasingly diminished. And I think, and you may agree with me on this, I think that we have not really seen the totality of this kind of incentive uh, to work program design. And it's something that we should probably continue to test in decades to come. The work of Allen and Turner are also important, or is also important, in how we understand the urban landscape. Their sociological research was primarily focused on metropolitan centers in the U.S. that received high percentages of international immigration, and they questioned the impact that immigration was making on American society, especially the urban landscape, from really three perspectives. So first, they considered the question, does concentration of individuals coming from outside of American society and then living in society, does that, in a sense, weaken assimilation into the host society? One of the critiques that many individuals in American society have today regarding immigrants who are coming to the United States and how they experience uh, racism and privilege is that they are too circumscribed, that they live inside their own bubble and they're not necessarily blending into the surrounding landscape. And they very much wanted to see if that was the case. What we find is that it really is not. Um, Another perspective or question is residential concentration a stage within the assimilation process for people who are coming from outside of our society and desiring to be part of the American landscape? Well, again, this we're finding to be generally the case, that there is a kind of a seeding period where people come in. Maybe they are being brought in by family members or friends from a community that have migrated prior to their arrival. They are then helped to assimilate into American society by these households. And very often, people who are migrating to the United States will find their first job through a friend or family member. And then the third thing that they were really looking at is the concentration that's experienced. Is that, in a sense, um, experienced by all ethnic groups across the cityscape? And how does that concentration, whether it's intense or otherwise, how does that impact equality, or how people are engaging equality as it relates to opportunity, both economic, political, and or social? So here too we see a concern that is being given to ethnicities that are new to our American landscape, and how they may or may not be experiencing varying levels of privilege, and how they may or may not be experiencing varying levels of discrimination. And that's the key here. And that, again, is part of a larger philosophy, of larger point that Shirley Better in her work has also addressed, which is really trying to get a hold historically and even in terms of modern expressions of this practice, really trying to get a hold of how people experience the social structure and how that social structure, in a sense, impacts their quality of life. I'll end this brief lecture with a little bit of Shirley's words. This is drawn from the first chapter of her primer. The chapter's title is Conceptualizing Racism, and it's associated with a section in also labeled Eliminating Whiteness in this case. And so let me give you a little bit of an idea here. So whiteness, in terms of how a sociologist is using this in their research, is a measure of privilege. The idea that whiteness has always been associated with privilege in American society, and one's overall expression or engagement of whiteness will be a measure of how they experience or engage, in this case, discrimination or privilege. She writes, the discussion of whiteness in American society is a relatively new area of study. And again, she's writing this in 2008. It offers a new way of thinking about inequality. The term white race is as much a social construct as the term race itself. The term whiteness denotes an unearned status in a society that strives to be a meritocracy. And as noted previously, and again, this is part of a larger chapter, the perpetuation of this special status has reinforced wide scale misery throughout the country. And again, the term, what she's meaning here is the term whiteness is something that historically has been assigned to privilege, and whether it's a good term or not to use in every situation, it is a social historical term that definitely is addressing this. So that's why she is using this term, even though it may not always refer to white racial issues, right? So that's again something that she is identifying. Because, she continues by saying, therefore, if we are to become a true meritocracy, whiteness has to be abolished. She's not talking about, in this case, removing whiteness from our society biologically. She's just saying the inequality must be, in a sense, abolished. She concludes her statement by saying, in order to rid our country of racism, we must rid ourselves of the power of the term, the concept, and the reality of whiteness, or in this case, differential privilege. She continues, writing, opposing whiteness should not be construed to mean opposing white people, but rather opposing the unearned status and rewards conferred on traditionally or historically white individuals. Just as African Americans have abandoned the term black to identify themselves, so should European Americans give up the term white. Both terms, she writes, contain negative connotations. Several scholars suggest that whites will need to critically examine how whiteness has become synonymous with oppression while creating a space for a white or Euro-American identity. How amazing would it be for an individual who is Caucasian in terms of census records to identify as Euro-American as opposed to white? So this is the main theme that her initial primer is taking, and this is something that ties us to Peggy McIntosh's work regarding the invisible knapsack, the idea that there are things that we don't see ourselves that connect to our own individual privilege or how we experience on a daily basis discrimination. And we have to look at that, as do individuals who may be partaking in those forces that reinforce one or the other. From there, we then have to move into social structural spheres to be able to understand how a society, by its structural nature, its institutions, how these institutions, in a sense, contribute to privilege or helped to deconstruct privilege. I think one of the really important areas of reformation that is occurring today in our society, or reform in our society today, is the criminal justice system. We need equality under the law. If we cannot achieve equality under the law, then everything really is lost. Another area, of course, that Shirley Better stresses is equality in an economic sense. If we cannot achieve economic inequality, if we cannot truly get to that liberal individualism, which lies at the heart of even conservative values in the United States, then we have done ourselves an injustice as a society. And I think a lot of us are cognizant of that, and a lot of us are working and striving to break down that kind of inequality in the United States. Because if there is anything that embodies what it means to be America, it is our plurality, it is our diversity, and it is our love for one another.